in World Opinions, you identified, three very clear factors that were behind what was a pretty dramatic sell-off in the market on Monday morning. And just I wanted to chat with you, as I thought, who knows about this stuff? You were the first on my list. So first of all, thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this.
Well, thank you for having me and for the kind words. And yeah, I think it's kind of important to note that it's really more than just Monday, because markets have gotten hit hard Thursday and Friday as well. And what I think made Monday a little more dramatic was that in the U.S. markets, it would have been the third day in a row, but that it was coming off of what to us was Sunday night, but was to Asia Monday, was Japan's market dropping 12.5% in one day. So far this week, as you and I are talking, Japan had its worst day ever since 1987 on Monday, and they had their best day ever on Tuesday, their recovery back. So that's the kind of volatility we're dealing with in global markets internationally. And so a lot of people seeing the futures Sunday night, which is night before market action that we can see and I'll spare everyone the wonky details of how that's done. I think people could have assumed that the U.S. markets looked like they were going to open down Monday because it was a follow-up of what had been going on Thursday and Friday, which were more U.S.-centric problems in the economy and in the market. But then by Monday morning, it was very clear, oh no, now what's hitting us is a follow-up from what's happening in Asia. And so that's why in World, I kind of described it as three different things, and I'm convinced I'm right about those three. But I also believe that the sequence was important, that's like in order of priority. And so number one on Monday was what's called the yen carry trade. The Japanese yen has been a very weak currency. It yields very little. Therefore, it's very cheap to borrow, and then you can go buy other things with cheap borrowed yen. And it's a way to take more risk for international investors to borrow in yen and buy other investments they may want to own. The yen rallied substantially, one of the biggest 5-day rallies against the dollar ever. And the Bank of Japan announced a small quarter-point rate hike that was unexpected. And it just caused all of these people who had borrowed to have to panic sell. So that's what we're talking about when we use terms like an unwind of a yen carry trade. If I said to my wife, she just ignores it, like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I get it. The language may sound a little bit mysterious, but that's what we're talking about, is a whole lot of people, hundreds of billions of dollars, were caught off sides by borrowing in the Japanese currency and having to panic sell. That's the primary driver of Monday. However, it took place in the same course of the U.S. markets already having started to correct in the NASDAQ, our big tech companies. Some of these that have had a big move up lately, like NVIDIA and Microsoft. The NASDAQ had actually been going down since July 10th. So it had been almost 3-4 weeks already. And as of Monday, the NASDAQ was down 13.5% from its high. And so it was a kind of secondary story. It's one I believe, and I'm quite on record as saying, very likely has a long way to go. It could very well rally like it has the last couple of days since Monday. It's going to be up and down, but we just have way overdone this AI story, this artificial intelligence mania. And I think there's a lot more correction to potentially come out of these overvalued tech stocks. And then it leaves us with the third thing, John, which is the economy. Is just essentially markets have been in a pretty good wave for a long time of knowing that the Fed was basically done raising rates. It's been over a year. It was July of last summer when they last raised rates, and yet that the economy had not gone into recession. Now we have known for some time that we're getting closer and closer to the Fed cutting rates, and we still never really saw unemployment go up that much. Credit conditions tighten too much, not a lot of economic deterioration. So it's what we call Goldilocks, this sort of not too hot, not too cold, everything kind of worked out. Well, now people are worried, okay, the economy is slowing a little bit. Maybe it's not recessionary, but you had a really bad jobs report on Friday. And it wasn't a great one the month before either. So now the narrative gets into markets of maybe the economy is slowing going into next year. Our tech sector is overvalued. And it's the last thing we need is to have this yen carry trade going on. All of those things converged into about a 24-hour period.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think was really helpful is that this is three factors. You don't get quite the panic without all three factors kind of showing up at the same time. A little bit of a perfect storm. But on the worldview side of this, especially from a Christian worldview perspective, there were two things in particular that I thought were really helpful. The hyper politicization, everything being about politics. Obviously everyone went to Twitter or X now, the source of all truth in the Western world, and proclaimed this is Trump's fault, this is Kamala's fault, immediately going to these political reasons. You came out and said, it's not either one of them. To what degree can we blame it on either political party at this point?
Well, let's answer it two different ways. First, how can we blame this volatility, these big sell-offs and big rallies on the political side? The answer is not at all. Not like 10%, 5%, 20%. I mean 0%. Now, by the way, it's self-evident. Are we to believe markets dropped 1,000 points Monday because we were afraid of Kamala Harris, and it went up 1,000 points Tuesday because we weren't afraid of Kamala Harris? And then it's not related on up and down movement to politics. It's an incoherent idea. But even when you get rid of the volatility of it, then the more deep issue of, well, this candidate's good for the market, this candidate's bad for the market, I would argue there can be some truth in that. Markets like tax cuts and markets like deregulation and markets like a pro-business agenda, whatever that may look like. Let's say I had a crystal ball and knew that a certain candidate was going to win who wanted to increase export of liquefied natural gas. Then I think that sector could start to price some of those things in. But even then, you need Senate approval because there's committees and other technicalities in American form of government. So just as there's nuance in our civics, there's nuance in our markets.
And there's realities about the human condition. And you've written about that in a new book called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I want to get to that here in a second, because I think a lot of times, and this goes to the second thing that I think really made me want to have this conversation right now. It had been a while since the economic news or a particular event like what happened, as you described it, these three factors coming out emerging over the weekend, kind of hitting this perfect storm, created the level of panic. I mean, there's a lot of panic on Monday. And of course, a lot of that panic comes, maybe not with you. You were probably, sitting back saying, okay, how do I navigate this? But for the average person, a lot of people check their retirement accounts. Bad idea to do on Monday, right? And a lot of people watch the news. Another bad idea to do on Monday when, the panicked headlines about this unprecedented sell-off. And I appreciated a handful of commentaries, National Review, some others that, just clarified, look, this, the last time this happened was 2022. It really wasn't that far ago, at least percentage-wise.
And it's not in the top 100.
That's an important point.
Not even in the top
100.
Even not in the top 10 is important, but not in the top 100. And so it's funny. My 14-year-old son, who's my youngest, he was saying, Dad, market down 1,000 points, is this the worst, whatever? And I was talking to him about the market was down 777 points in September 2008, and that was significantly worse. And he said, well, what do you mean? It's over 1,000 today. And I said, let's do a little math. If we're down 777 points when the Dow was at 10,000, you're talking about 7 or 8%. And if you're talking about being down 1,000 points when the Dow's at 40,000, you're talking about 2 to 2.5%, right? And that's forgotten too. And the media wants it to be forgotten because I admit the drama of saying 1,000 points is much better than saying 2%.
Yeah. And it's that fear aspect that I think has to speak to us as followers of Christ, right? I mean, when Scripture says that fear of the Lord casts out all other fear, that's got to include economic fears. And, this emerges too. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of it has to do with getting past the hype and getting to the realities of the market, the realities of the numbers, like you said, and also then just what are we required to believe and think as followers of Christ in relation to kind of fears of the market?
Yeah, well, it's not my view that Christians necessarily have to be in the market. I do believe Christians' investment plans and parable of the talents principles should mean that they're invested in human productivity. And so I am a big fan in trying to tether our future investment to our God-created capacity for co-creation and productivity and innovation. And it is true that that generally takes the form and risk-taking of things that are more equity-like than defensive. But that's a broader conversation, maybe for another day. But yes, the general framework you're describing, I think, is very important sociologically. Whether it's fear of a market sell-off or fear of a political election outcome, the general framework of Christians living in fear and despair is unacceptable in a biblical worldview. And fear not is the commandment repeated most in Scripture. Out of every other commandment, being told not to be afraid. Now, that doesn't mean you should go stand in the middle of a railroad track and not be afraid, but however, I do think it's important when you have a perspective, a sort of sober judgment that comes from the Christian understanding of God's sovereignty, of control, of when you have sensible plans in place, understanding that there's unpredictabilities in the world that are going to come up and that those things don't dislodge us. And so I don't want to be guilty of taking biblical language and biblical concepts and misapplying them to a bad portfolio. People who have a bad portfolio should try to get a good portfolio. And that, again, that's a whole other conversation. But yes, good plans, good portfolios, our general plans that we do in life are always subject to unpredictable things, and we should not be undone in fear in those moments.